Good evening and welcome to another edition of You and Your Money. I'm Brian Hirsch and our subject this evening is healthcare. We won't be taking calls this evening, but I will be answering emails that have come in since our last program on this subject. The dangers of not having medical aid cover is probably one of the biggest risks one can assume. We all know and heard about the long queues in our public hospitals. How many can self-fund for medical expenses in private healthcare? While CPI has increased 5.6% over the last year, medical aid rates increased between 9.5% and 12%. This increase really only applies to healthy individuals. For those who are unfortunately ill, they also have to contend probably with higher co-payments. There's a shortage of doctors in the countries, and many of them at this stage are able to charge whatever they like. At least if one has a hospital plan, then it's possible that your medical aid may have entered into arrangements with several preferred providers that will limit your costs. And joining me this evening are Alan Peddle of Discovery Health and Clayton Samsodien of Genesis EB Solutions. Elaine, Clayton, thank you very much for joining me. The first question is, how big a problem is it that many South Africans don't have medical aids? What percentage are covered? And then, how is the NHI going to address this?
Yeah. So, you know, all the statistics show that about 15% of South Africans have access to private medical aid. There are a number of people who do go to the private healthcare system and pay for it themselves. The challenge, I think, is really one of saying what risks are you exposing yourself to if you don't have medical aid? You've always got the public sector to fall back on with the problems that may involve. If you're looking to go into the private healthcare system without access to a medical aid, you could be facing bills of R500,000, R1 million, depending on the types of treatments you need. We know cancer treatments, for example, upwards of 800,000 Rand. We know of major motor vehicle accidents for 500,000 Rand, depending obviously on the severity of the case. We had our largest claim ever in Discovery Health Medical Scheme last year of a 16 million Rand claim. So the reality is that going into the private healthcare system without the protection of a medical aid can leave you very heavily exposed. But obviously there are sections of the public healthcare sector which have very high quality, but that's the exposure that you're putting yourself in.
And how is NHI going to address it? I can't see all of a sudden an enormous amount of people studying, becoming doctors and entering public service.
So I mean, I think there's two answers to that question. The first one is to say that the underlying thinking around the national health insurance model is that by reorganizing the healthcare system in South Africa, reorganizing the public and the private healthcare system, bringing more managerial expertise, designing more efficient systems, monitoring costs, contracting in different ways, that you may get a better handle on the costs and make the whole system more efficient. And if it's more efficient, then in theory you can have a lot more people going through and being treated by the same facilities. It also requires a substantive investment in the underlying public healthcare system. So the thinking around NHI is to make it better by making it more efficient, better allocation of resources, focusing money where it's needed the best. In terms of doctors, however, it is also true that South Africa would need a lot more doctors to provide adequate public or private or public or mix of them to all South Africans. And that's really a long-term investment, 10 to 15 years to train a specialist, for example. My view is that people often talk about the NHI on a 10-year time horizon. That gives us time to start training up more doctors today. But we're not seeing right now the kind of doubling, tripling, quadrupling of places in medical schools, for example, that would best be needed in order to do this.
Clayton, medical aids, I mean, it's part of your business. I mean, how would the NHI affect it, if at all?
Well, I think the medical aid will always be there, so you'll always find that the affluent would purchase private health care in some form or another, whether it is a top-up form of cover to what NHI is going to provide. And of course those that are able to skip the queues anyway, because they can afford it, would certainly do so. But like we see in the UK, I'm certain that there will be a place for private health care, and it would always be there. I just think the form would be slightly different to what we possibly see now.
Clayton, you know, we talk about medical aids, the complexities. I mean, your job is to educate members. It must be very difficult, because I'm starting to hear and see myself that medical aids become very complicated.
Absolutely. Consumers, I think, make a fundamental mistake of shopping around at the websites of medical schemes, and they tick a little box, I'm interested, and the next thing you know, a consultant would phone them, but unbeknown to them, that consultant is actually in some way aligned to that particular scheme. They're on what is called sort of a leads panel type of thing. So, my advice would be that you need to find an independent advisor that can advise you correctly with the choice of your medical scheme. And it's not just relevant today on what the benefits and the cost are. There are all sorts of technicalities, like, as you say, treatment protocols, clinical protocols that changes the benefit design from scheme to scheme.
Well, we'll certainly discuss with Alan, because I think you guys are probably responsible for complicating medical aids a little bit. I'll give you that to think about during our break. We're going to take a short break. You're watching You and Your Money. You're on Business Day TV. Stay tuned. Welcome back to You and Your Money. Tonight we're discussing healthcare. My guests Clayton Samsodien and Alan Peddle. We're talking about medical aid. However, we're not going to be taking calls this evening. I will deal with some questions that we've received on email. And before we left off the program, I was saying to Clayton that I think medical aids have been quite complicated, and the difficulty that both medical aids and brokers have are educating not the individual, but the individual that works for a company that may be all over the place. I mean, you talk about sessions and you talk about education, but not everyone can attend those sessions. And I think deep down, the change from the old generation to new generation has become quite complicated.
So I'm going to try and give a simple answer to a complicated question. Everybody wants a medical aid plan that is as cheap as possible, that covers everything with no questions asked. And in many ways, I think that's the ideal model. I gave you some examples earlier in the interview about how expensive some aspects of healthcare have become, and that's a problem we see around the world. The United Kingdom, the United States, everywhere, basically facing this issue of medical aid inflation. The strategies that have been used to kind of try and keep healthcare protection affordable is to focus in on the areas of greatest need, to try and encourage people to take responsibility where they can, and there are aspects of healthcare where people can make choices. Glasses, for example, your choice of frame is a good example. Your generics versus brand names, various other issues. And today we present people the options of saying, if you want a cheaper type of medical aid, it's possible. But there are increasing sets of rules and restrictions and networks and whatnot that are evaded. So the answer is, a lot of the complexity is driven by a desire to provide a cheaper, more cost-effective option for members. And what happens along the way is that the cheaper, more cost-effective options may exclude certain things, or may ask you to behave in a particular way, or may expect certain types of behavior patterns from your doctor, which are usually guided by clinical best practice. But it is complicated, and certainly at a consumer level it's difficult. Maybe just one anecdote. I've recently seen a study from the United States where they say that your average health insurance member in the United States spends 20 minutes a year on understanding their healthcare, interacting with their health insurance. It's probably similar in South Africa. And 20 minutes is possibly too little to understand everything that's in that fairly complex contract that you've signed.
Clayton, that's a difficulty for you, because when particularly people are struggling to make ends meet, the first question maybe I should ask you, are you finding people downgrading medical aids? And secondly, when they do downgrade, do they actually understand what they're losing?
Well, firstly, I just want to add, that medical schemes, and particularly the larger administrators, have done phenomenal work in developing technology like apps. So you could go into a medical scheme's app platform as an example, and you can understand quite a bit regarding your medical scheme and its benefits and how to use it. I think it's important to mention that there is this drive from the product provider to educate the member themselves, excluding ourselves as brokers. We have to do that too. But certainly that is the case, yeah.
And so when they're downsizing, I mean, you've actually now, because your job is actually to provide appropriate advice, and as a healthcare solution provider, you've got to make sure that the member, when he says, I want to downgrade, understands what benefits they're losing.
Absolutely.
Not just hears it, but actually sees it and understands it.
Strangely enough, I mean, our experience, and I'm not sure if that was the same on the Discovery experience last year, but we've seen more upgrades last year than downgrades, and that is just against the grain. What everyone's saying is healthcare is becoming unaffordable. I think the consumer is becoming more wise in how to choose their needs and their benefits correctly, and certainly we've seen really an increase in upgrades rather, and even I think this year when Discovery had the upgrade window period, we've had significant people upgrading during that period. So people are purchasing more cover, that is for sure. But on the side of downgrading, yes, there's a number of pitfalls. You know, like you could have used up all your medical savings for the year, and that could result in clawbacks on your medical savings account should you downgrade earlier. And then of course there's all other pitfalls in that, you know, your health condition could change overnight, and you could sit with a lower plan than what you previously had.
I know you can't answer for the industry, you can still certainly answer for Discovery. Have you found people upgrading, downgrading?
Yeah, we for the last 3 or 4 years have seen more people upgrade than downgrade. Yeah.
Surprise you?
Yes, on one level, because we are always hearing the stories about the financial stress in the environment, but I think our insight into this is that many people realize the importance of healthcare, and I think there is a sense of worry. What would happen if I were to be exposed to these high costs and not have any form of financial protection?
Well, let's take some emails. George in Ladysmith says, at what stage can one move up from a hospital to a comprehensive plan?
Well, it differs from scheme to scheme, Brian. Firstly is that some schemes don't allow upgrades during the year. Typically you could only make that choice during October, November for the benefit year starting 1 January. But there are schemes that allow an option change or an upgrade rather in the event of a life-threatening, upon diagnosis of a life-threatening event like cancer. So they would allow an upgrade.
Without a waiting period?
Without a waiting period.
So you go to the doctor, you find somebody who's got a very major illness, and you can suddenly upgrade. I mean,
absolutely.
Would you allow that?
No.
Are you only going to allow it at a certain period?
We're allowed at 1 January. Our view is that...
Irrespective. So if I was one of the unfortunate ones in December, I found that I had one of these dreaded diseases and I need a lot of treatment, you couldn't stop me upgrading?
No, I'll let you upgrade on 1 January, absolutely.
Okay. Irrespective, no exclusions? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, Dorothy in Rivonia says, what right does my medical aid have to overrule the form of treatment that my doctor has prescribed? Firstly, is that correct?
No. So the first point is...
No, so I mean, we hear about it, that you've got to get authorization.
Yeah, so I think interesting, I mean, there's many issues here. We can't override any recommended treatment, but you know, ours is a funding product, so we do have rules about what we will pay for. So typically, if it's a chronic illness, for example, we have certain criteria which says, you know, once your blood sugar or your HbA1c or your cholesterol score goes above a certain point, then we'll register you on our chronic illness benefit, and then we have a set of drugs which we cover in full, and others which you may have a co-payment for. If your doctor insists on one of those drugs, there's a process for a clinical appeal to say here's the clinical motivation for that. If it's a cancer treatment, we refer them to the Oncology Society of South Africa, for example. There are certain cases where we may not fund a treatment, but often that's because they're extremely experimental, they're unproven, there's no literature that supports that, in which case, you know, once again, we'll fund within the constraints of the benefit, but we won't fund any further.
Clayton, you see it from the other side. Clients, patients who may come to you and say, I don't understand why Discovery aren't allowing this, or you agree, I mean, you don't see this overruling. Everyone thinks that someone at the end of a call centre is telling you that you can't have this treatment because some specialist, you know, has prescribed it.
Yeah, well, firstly I have to say is that some of our experiences is that it's the members' insistence on a particular treatment based on whatever they are experiencing at that time. It's not really of any form of a clinical nature, but what I have seen, particularly with the larger administrators, is that there's a lot more negotiation, a lot more of talk, and as Alan said, there's a lot more of motivation from a clinical point of view as to why a particular treatment is needed. And I've certainly found that once you work through the process, that eventually you'd reach a point where it's either agreeable by the funder or the member or the service provider agrees to that particular form of treatment.
Well, we're going to take a break. You're watching You and Your Money. You're on Business Day Television. Stay tuned. Welcome back to New Money, and we're talking healthcare this evening. My guests are Clayton Samsodien and Elaine Peddle. Please stay tuned, but we're going to now deal with some emails. Jono in Port Elizabeth says, please explain what role Board of Healthcare Funders plays between medical aids and regulators. Does it play a role?
The Board of Healthcare Funders is an organisation representing a number of medical schemes, not all, probably about 40% of the market. It's a collective body. Yeah. They sometimes speak on behalf of the industry to the regulatory body. There's no...
But it's not compulsory to be a member. Not all medical administrators belong to it. No. Let's just talk about the most critical parties. I've been in the financial industry for 47 years. And over the last 5 to 10 years, people are not shy to negotiate fees. You have a standard fee on healthcare. I think you guys pay 3% on how many medical aids paid, a standard fee, but not scared to negotiate.
Yeah.
But they are scared to negotiate with their doctor. One says, talk to your doctor, see whether you can't negotiate a better deal. Very difficult when you're sitting in your doctor's room, you've got a major illness, and there's the man who's going to treat you.
Yeah, no, I mean, it is incredibly hard. We've thought about this a lot. On one hand, I think there's a responsibility of the medical scheme to do some of that negotiation on your behalf, but absolutely, I think in the same way as we're seeing consumer activism in every other sphere of human existence, right now I think people do need to take some responsibilities to ask that question. It is hard. It's a behavior change. Some tips. You can speak to the receptionist sometimes, not only the doctor. Find out before you go how much is this consultation, is this procedure going to ask. If you don't like speaking about this face-to-face, you can sometimes ask that receptionist for a quote and write a letter or write an email to the doctor saying, look, I'd like to discuss payment terms or whatever the case might be. So there are maybe ways of getting around it. A good discipline is really to have that conversation, but I mean, I know personally, and I know many other people, it's a hard one to have. I suspect that in other cultures people may say, what are you talking about? Of course you've got to ask, it's your money, and that's an important principle.
I'll tell you what happened recently. I got a call from a lady who they've discovered a growth on her neck. She went to the doctor, and the doctor said he needed to do an operation. She said she'd like to get a second opinion. The doctor nearly threw out. And then she apologized to the doctor. She said, I don't mean to offend you. The operation was meant to this was a Thursday, it was meant to take place on the Friday, and he refused to do it. Now, surely that's most unethical.
No, I mean, we live in a Consumer Protection Act environment. These guys at the end of the day, and I have the greatest respect for doctors, but they also need to understand that they're offering a service, and people have the right to understand what the service is and how much it's going to cost them. And it shouldn't be a difficult conversation to have, but we know it is. And I think if you look around the world, you're seeing more and more things which haven't happened in South Africa, where doctors are having to put their consultation rates up on websites. We're seeing social media sites develop where consumers are independently forming places where they tell people what rates are being charged. So I think it's a reality. That's the commercial and reality of our world going forward.
And you guys have taken the cue, because you are negotiating with a lot of preferred providers, and you have a large percentage of top professionals on your books.
Yeah. So I would advise one other step for our members right now is they can go online, they can look at a thing we call our MAPS tool, at the very least tell you which doctors have agreed to a contracted rate and which have not. And those that have not are doctors where you may face a high charge from that doctor. I think the other thing that lots of South Africans don't realize, and you made the point, doctors today really are entitled to charge anything they want. There is no sticker price for their treatment. So you may go to a doctor, assume that he charges a normal rate, but actually there's no reason to assume that he could charge anything he wants, really.
Well, Solomon in Heidelberg says, I'm dealing directly with my medical aid and I don't have a broker. I understand that in Discovery's case they pay a commission whether I have a broker or not. Therefore it makes sense to have a broker. But as an individual, do they really want such a small fry? And can all intermediaries advise me on healthcare? Clayton, first question is small fry, I mean individual. I know most medical aid or most brokers who are looking to give solutions deal with corporates, but the individual?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, in our case, we are considered as corporate healthcare consultants, but about 18% of our clients are individuals. But because we have that corporate sort of critical mass, we're able to deliver service to individuals. And I would argue that there are many other consultancies like ourselves out there that is able to deliver a service to individuals. Yes, you know, that it's just a numbers game. You know, the commissions are not as desirable or as profitable as what we'd like it to be, but certainly if you have got a significant size, you can deliver service on an individual basis.
And Clayton, what will you do? I mean, one individual A doesn't have a broker, individual B does have a broker. You can't influence payments. What role can you actually play as that broker?
Well, you know what, I still believe that medical schemes unfortunately do make quite a number of mistakes, and members don't understand this. And you know, our role is to act on behalf of the best interest of that particular individual and member. So, you know, we have, I always call it, the love-hate relationships with medical schemes. You know, when they pay the claims, we love them. When they don't, easy to see, is it possible that we could perhaps lodge a complaint at the Council for Medical Schemes for non-payment of a claim that we believe they should. But the most important role is the advice that is given to that individual in selecting its plan choice. Medical schemes have done phenomenal work in making sure the administrative systems, support systems work well, and that's developed really well recently and over the years. But the advice, the selection of what plan really suits your needs, that is the critical role that the broker should be playing.
Do you support that?
Yeah, I think so. So, in general, obviously, we aim to make as few mistakes as possible, but sometimes the broker plays an important role.
Statistics reflect that individuals use more than 60% of their total medical aid spend in the last 3 years of their lives. There's also a belief that the healthier you are, the less you have need for a sophisticated medical aid. There's no doubt there's some truth in this. However, we all know that ill health and accidents can happen in a split second. For those who do not have medical aid, I urge you to investigate at least hospital cover for those emergencies. It's important that one fully understands the benefits offered by your scheme. And I'd like to thank Clayton and Alan for joining me this evening. Before acting on any advice you may have heard, please consult with your medical aid broker or directly with your medical aid. It's important to note that our program tonight is to provide information and should not be construed as advice. If you need to get hold of me, my details will appear on the screen. Next week will be another pre-recorded program. I'll be dealing with estate planning. Please send me your emails. I'd like to thank you for watching, and good night.